Hold on. In 2021, the Venezuelan government removed 6 zeros from its currency. Not 1, not 3, 6. A note worth 1 million bolivares was reprinted to say 1. That was the third time since 2008 that Venezuela had stripped zeros from its money rather than address what the number meant. Venezuela holds the largest proven oil reserves on the planet. It is a founding member of OPEC. And today, Venezuelans are waiting in lines measured in hours to buy gasoline because the country that once shaped global energy policy cannot refine its own crude. This is the documented story of how that happened. A decision made in February 2003, a workforce of 18,000. And the thing that left with them that no government decree has ever been able to bring back. But the part of this story that changes everything isn't the decision. It's what walked out the door with the people who were fired. Let's start with Venezuela in the year 2000. In 2000, Venezuela was not a fragile economy. It was an oil empire. At the center of that empire was PDVSA, Petróleos de Venezuela S.A. It was founded when the Venezuelan government nationalized its oil sector in 1976, and unlike most state oil companies of its era, it chose to run it professionally. Over 2 decades, it built something genuinely rare, a national oil company that could compete technically with the international majors. It had its own overseas refineries. It owned Citgo, the American petroleum company, which operated refineries in Texas, Louisiana, and Illinois, and supplied fuel across the eastern and southern United States. It trained engineers to manage some of the world's most chemically complex crude extracting oil from the Orinoco Belt, a vast formation running across the center of the country containing more proven reserves than the entire Middle East. In 2000, Venezuela was producing approximately 3.3 million barrels of oil per day, one of the 5 largest exporters on Earth, a founding member of the cartel that had set global energy prices since 1960, and in the 1990s, it had deliberately opened its sector to international co-development. Chevron, ExxonMobil, Total, ConocoPhillips, not as a concession, but as a strategic decision to bring capital and technology into the heavy oil development it knew would require both. The money was real. The technical capacity was real. The system worked. But underneath the production numbers, there was a political fault line that Hugo Chavez, who took the presidency in February 1999, had been widening since the day he arrived. PDVSA's workforce was educated, technically sophisticated, and largely middle class in a country where most people were not. Chavez had read that gap as a political threat, and by 2002, he was moving to resolve it. And what those 18,000 engineers and technicians actually carried with them, the thing that made them irreplaceable rather than merely employed, is the part of this story that changes everything that comes after. But the confrontation came in December 2002, and what Chavez did in response to it changed Venezuela permanently. Here is what the standard account of Venezuela's collapse usually misses. The grievance behind Chavez's oil policy was real. For decades, Venezuela's oil revenue had circulated within a narrow professional class, while most Venezuelans saw almost none of it. PDVSA operated like a parallel state, technically sophisticated, financially powerful, and largely disconnected from the poverty that surrounded it. When Chavez argued that PDVSA existed to serve Venezuelan society rather than its own employees and foreign shareholders, he was identifying a genuine failure. The desire to redirect oil wealth toward hospitals, schools, and anti-poverty programs was a legitimate policy position. The execution destroyed the country. In December 2002, PDVSA's technical workforce went on strike, protesting Chavez's move to replace the company's apolitical leadership with political loyalists. The strike lasted 2 months. When it ended, Chavez fired approximately 18,000 workers, not the administrative staff, not the political opponents, but the geologists, drilling engineers, and reservoir specialists who had spent careers learning the specific pressure profiles, geological formations, and infrastructure vulnerabilities of Venezuela's individual oil fields. But here's the detail that often gets lost in the telling. These workers were not foreign executives protecting corporate margins. They were Venezuelan citizens, graduates of Venezuelan universities, the technical class of their own country's most important industry. When they were fired, they did not become obstacles to Venezuelan sovereignty. They became the reason Venezuelan sovereignty over oil could no longer function. Production stood at 3.3 million barrels per day in 2001. By 2020, Venezuela was producing fewer than 400,000 barrels daily. That is not a typo. A country sitting on the world's largest proven oil reserves had collapsed its own output by nearly 90%. And in 2018, the IMF estimated Venezuela's annual inflation rate at 1 million percent. That is not a typo. 1 million, published in the IMF's own World Economic Outlook database. You can seize the wells. You cannot seize the knowledge of what is inside them. That knowledge was not stored in PDVSA's legal structures or government registries. It was stored in the people who built the industry. And when those people left, the industry left with them. And what Maduro's government did quietly in 2022, without a press conference, without a public announcement, is the part of this that makes everything else make sense. Which is why, by the time that reversal came, Venezuela was not negotiating from strength. It was petitioning. In November 2022, the United States Treasury Department issued a license allowing Chevron Corporation to resume limited oil production operations in Venezuela. That sentence requires a moment. The Venezuelan government that had spent 20 years making the expulsion of foreign oil companies a nationalist cornerstone, that in 2007 had forced ExxonMobil and ConocoPhillips out of the country when they refused to accept minority stake terms, that had celebrated their departure in state-funded media as a sovereign victory, was quietly inviting American petroleum engineers back into its fields, not as partners in a position of strength, as operators with the technical capacity that Venezuela's own workforce could no longer provide. The stated rationale involved electoral reform negotiations and geopolitical dialogue. Those framings were accurate as far as they went. What they did not address was the operational reality. Venezuela's own production data, submitted to OPEC, showed output had fallen so far that the country could no longer sustain basic government functions on oil revenue alone. The Chavez government had built its entire political identity around the idea that Venezuelan oil belonged to Venezuela, not to foreign capital. The Maduro government was now quietly offering favorable production terms to the same American companies that had been cast as imperial villains in state-funded media for a generation. The engineers, who were fired in 2003, did not wait for reinstatement. They went to Calgary, to Houston, to Bogota, to Lisbon. They were hired by Chevron, ExxonMobil, and Equinor. By 2023, some of those same experts, Venezuelan-born and Venezuelan-trained, were consulting for foreign companies re-entering Venezuela under conditions Chavez had spent his political career denouncing. 7 million Venezuelans had emigrated by that point, documented by UNHCR as the largest displacement crisis in the history of the Western Hemisphere. Not because of war, not because of invasion, because the productive economy that once sustained ordinary Venezuelan life no longer existed. The country that invented the doctrine of oil sovereignty could not produce its own oil without foreign engineers. You can seize an oil field. You cannot seize an oil industry. That distinction between physical infrastructure and the knowledge required to operate it is what Venezuela's government treated as unimportant, and it is the explanation for everything that followed. The wells did not disappear. The drilling platforms remained in the Orinoco Belt. What left were the people who understood them, and with those people went 20 years of accumulated, field-specific knowledge that no government decree and no replacement workforce could reconstruct. This is not a story about Venezuela specifically. It is what happens when any government, anywhere, decides that expertise is a form of political disloyalty rather than a national asset to be protected. When competence becomes suspect, the institution that depends on it begins its collapse the moment the first expert walks out. Venezuela made that decision deliberately, publicly, and repeatedly over 15 years. The documented record shows exactly when the decline accelerated and exactly why. The wells are still there. The people who knew how to run them are not coming back.